Hey guys, so we are still talking about evolution, so I'm going to do my best to try and give you guys these lessons over your PowerPoint via Nearpod. We'll see how this goes. Hopefully I don't overload it with like way too much information and you're able to get through this and it's not super slow and we can make it through this chapter together. Remember, this is going to be one of 3 parts that are on your test. You'll have the taxonomy and classification, this evolution part, and then biodiversity that we haven't gotten to yet. So make sure you're keeping up with your notes. And yes, I'm still going to expect you to have this in your notebook for a note check. So please don't give up the chance for a free 100, especially now that you kind of sort of have the PowerPoint slides like forever and with my explanations. So because of this, I'm going to expect like super good grades on this test. Hopefully this works out really well and we can kind of keep this up and get through this whole crazy COVID-19 shutdown together. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so pay special attention to this definition of evolution because it's going to be the only definition of evolution that I use throughout this entire chapter. It's going to be change over extremely long, extended periods of time. If you take nothing else away from this chapter except what I'm about to say, I'm perfectly okay with that. Just please make sure you know and understand that the theory of evolution never has and never will say that man came from monkeys, because quite frankly, that's just not true. There's no evidence to support that or back it up. The picture you see on this slide that's posted everywhere with evolution is just artwork and has no scientific backing to it whatsoever. So please just know that I'm going to refer to evolution as change over really long, drawn out periods of time, and do not expect you to believe any other of that man came from monkey craziness, because that's just not what the theory says. So, similar to how Aristotle had really early ideas for classification that later got fine tuned and perfected by Linnaeus, Jean Baptiste de Lamarck had some ideas about evolution early on, but his ideas were way off the mark. And we kind of sort of mock his ideas a little bit now. So he proposed this hypothesis. Notice that this is a hypothesis. It didn't even make it to the next level, and we say the theory of evolution. So this got knocked off way early in its conceptual phase. But his hypothesis said that it was going to explain how species changed over time and that traits developed over a parent's lifetime could be passed on to their offspring. Now, what that means is literally any trait that you developed right now and in the future, you could pass on to potential offspring. That meant if a woman dyed her hair blue, there's a chance her baby could have blue hair because that was a trait she acquired during her lifetime. That's also going along the lines of saying if 2 bodybuilders decided to have a child, that they could in turn have muscular baby. And we know now that's so not even remotely close to how genetics work. Like it should sound pretty laughable and funny because it's so far from being correct. And the picture with the giraffes here is showing what Lamarck would have said is in the first picture, the giraffes with the really short necks would have stretched their necks over time, which is being shown in picture 2 and 3. And eventually they would have stretched their necks long enough and passed these stretched necks down to their offspring to make giraffes taller over time. This very wrong idea is known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And I'm fairly certain that that is one of your test questions, is knowing the term of acquired characteristics. So make no mistake, he was intelligent for his time and his ideas and the limited technology and knowledge that they had, but he definitely wasn't anywhere close to the bullseye on that target as far as how species change and pass traits on to their offspring. Okay, so we've gotten to the history part of this section. In understanding the theory of evolution, you need to know about its creator, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a naturalist on the HMS Beagle's expedition to explore the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are a small island chain off the western coast of Ecuador in South America. Now, this was a very, very long voyage at sea. This is back in the 1800s. So, nothing fancy as far as sailing technology. And at this point, the Panama Canal did not exist. So, in order to get from England to Ecuador, they had to literally sail all the way down the Atlantic Ocean around the southern tip of South America and end up at the Galapagos Islands. Then they literally kept going west across the Pacific Ocean and sailed all the way back up to where it reaches the Atlantic and back up to England for a very long round trip. Now, his job as the naturalist on this voyage was to document everything that he could see and observe about the wildlife, flora, and fauna on the Galapagos Islands, and even bring back samples. He filled this ship's cargo area with samples, some of which are still displayed in Europe today. And when he was at the Galapagos, he noticed these species of finches. And you're never going to be able to talk about Darwin or evolution without talking about the Galapagos finches. Now, what was so special about him was he noticed that each island had its own little variation of what almost looked like the same finch, which looked almost exactly like the finches on the mainland in South America. So he paid specific attention to their body size, beak shape, and eating habits. And the last two are super important and closely related to each other. Here you can see some pictures of the beautiful Galapagos Islands. These islands are on my bucket list. They're amazing. They will only let certain amounts of travelers per year go to these islands, and they're doing their best to preserve them and keep them as natural of state as possible, because these islands are home to some of the most unique species that are found nowhere else on the planet and will never be found anywhere else on the planet. There's all sorts of unique ecosystems and especially organisms that you'll see here in a minute. So the first creature we're going to look at is the lovely, not so little marine iguana. Now, the pictures you see on the right show it doing what it does best. It is marine, which means salt water. It will dive off of cliffs down to the bottom of the ocean, which is somewhat shallow at this point, and eat the algae you can see in the upper right hand corner. And it can hold its breath for several minutes at a time, and it is the only marine iguana on the face of the planet, despite all the many, many, many species. The iguana that you see on the left is not spray painted, has not been graffitied, but those are the mating colors of that male iguana. What they will do is display their mating colors like this. They will stake out territories on these cliffs and try to attract their mate to say, hey, I've got the best location in real estate, and by the way, aren't I pretty? And this is the marine iguana. Next, we have the adorable and super cute Galapagos penguin. And no, this is not a trick or a hoax. I purposely picked these pictures, that way you could see like the green, beautiful lushness in the background. So you may not be aware, but there are multiple species of penguin in the world, and actually a good majority of them live in warm weather areas, and the Galapagos penguin is no exception. It's cute, it's precious, and it's totally living on these very, very warm tropical islands and loving it. Okay, so this strange little bird that you see here is the blue-footed booby. Not a typo, not a mispronunciation. That is its real name. And the reason the blue-footed boobies are in such weird-looking poses up in the top two pictures is because they do this crazy little mating dance to attract their mate. And I apologize for the background noises you're hearing because my cats are deciding to be very naughty and make lots of racket right now. So, the blue-footed booby also has a relative on the island, the red-footed booby. Now, they do not mate with each other, so no purple-footed boobies, and the red-footed booby even has its own special mating dance too, which is totally different from the blue-footed one. So these are probably some of the stranger creatures with some of these stranger names on the island, but they are found nowhere else on the earth, and they are kind of cool looking. And last but certainly not least, we have the organism that the island is probably the most famous for, and that is the huge, giant Galapagos tortoise. They are massive creatures. They can live to be in excess of 400 years old, and they are very endangered. On the island, they've tried to establish breeding programs to get their numbers up. You can see the itty bitty little tiny babies compared to the full grown adult in the bottom right hand corner. You can see them compared to a full grown adult female in the upper left hand corner. These are not small creatures at all, so even imagine how tall and huge they'd be when they're on their, like, drawn up to their full height with their necks stretched out, like in the bottom left hand corner. So these are probably some of the hallmark species of the islands that everyone's probably heard of or at least seen hopefully once. But the breeding program so far has been quite successful with them in captivity, and we're hoping to see their numbers continue to climb. All right, back to our main lesson here. So, Darwin again noticed that the finches on the Galapagos Islands were super similar to the finch species he had seen on the South American mainland of Ecuador. And the biggest trait that he noticed differences in were the beak shape. And beak shape is obviously going to be very much related to a bird's food source. It should make perfect sense that the beak shape best suited to an abundant food source is going to be the best trait for an organism to have and be successful. Because if an organism's unable to get food, that is one of the key resources it needs to stay alive, thrive, live long enough to reach mating age, and look healthy enough to actually end up attracting a mate. So, the beak shape best suited to each food because, again, each island kind of had its own little ecosystem, its own separate set of species. On certain islands, fish might be plentiful, or berries may be plentiful, or certain types of insects, or even nuts, or other types of foods for these birds. So, the beak shape was going to be suited to the most abundant food source for that organism. Now, because beak shape is so important and a key trait to survival, it makes sense that birds with a beak shape best suited to their environment would be living long enough to pass their genes on to their offspring. And Darwin also proposed that after many generations, it was this specialized beak that was necessary for survival being passed on through generation that maybe led to them becoming separate species. Now, when I say many generations, I don't mean like 20 generations. I'm meaning over 100 plus for each of these finches on each of these islands. So, this is why, again, we say evolution takes insanely long periods of time in order for it to even possibly produce a new species. And this is what's going to cause these finches to become different from one another and different from the mainland finches as well. Now you can finally see some of the finches and their beaks that we've been talking about this whole time. You can see the differences aren't like way different and crazy, but they are different enough that you would assume that they aren't from the same location, that they have very different food sources. Some look bulkier and more stout, which would have been great for crushing the shells of nuts. Others may be more pointy and narrow for trying to get into small spaces and maybe pick ants out of sand or something like that. But each of these specialized beak types served a purpose for this finch to have the best possible chance of getting food. And hopefully, this gives you an idea of what Darwin ended up noticing when he went to these islands, and how seeing all these very similar creatures with these very, very slight differences kind of led him down this path of traits being passed from parent to offspring. And those that are best adapted and suited to their environments are going to be those most likely to survive long enough to continue passing traits on from parent to offspring. Back to a little bit of history. So, he studied other organisms besides just those he found on the Galapagos Islands because he just couldn't drop these ideas. He just kept turning them over in his head, pondering about it, trying to do more research on this topic and maybe pull some strings together. There's actually a second man who typically does not get near as much credit, but his name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And he also came up with similar ideas for evolution along the same time as Darwin. They actually ended up writing letters to each other, comparing their ideas, talking about them, and discussing them. And because of Alfred Russel Wallace, Darwin was actually brave enough to end up publishing what he wrote because at this time he was kind of just sitting on it. And one of the main reasons he did not publish this, which I'm sure you can already guess, had to do with how extremely controversial his ideas were, especially to the church. At this point in time in England, you did not speak out against the church or contradict what it said because you would be deemed a heretic, and there were lots and lots of other punishments that could come with it. So Darwin was very cautious to publish these ideas. He eventually did publish his book on the origin of species, and it created huge shockwaves in both the scientific and religious communities. These ideas later became known as the theory of evolution by natural selection. And what natural selection means is survival of the fittest. This is why I like focusing more on natural selection because it's something you can actually see and understand genetically instead of just evolution has so many misconceptions tied around the world and it's almost like a bad word in general. So natural selection is much more logical and rational than just species evolving, which is why I almost would rather call this a natural selection chapter than an evolution chapter because of all the negative energy tied to that word. But here in the next little bit, you'll get to see what natural selection means and why I find it much more rational, logical, and easier to see. There are 5 principles of natural selection, and no, lucky for you, I'm not going to make you have to memorize all of them and write them on your test. You just need to kind of understand how they work together, and also please pay attention to the sheer amount of the maybes and what ifs and possiblies there are in this. because it's a very, very by chance process. It's not a definite is going to happen, boom, new species everywhere. So the first principle of natural selection is organisms produce more offspring than can survive. And probably some of the best examples of this are spiders and bugs. I'm sure the vast majority of you hate some sort of spider and or insect, and you are very good at killing them or will take the chance to squish them any chance you get. So obviously it is impossible to squish all the little spiders and ants and bugs and things that make you go ew. Then there are actual living organisms, which is why there's still little creepy crawlers out there. Number two, differences or variations occur among individuals of a species. This is normally the part where I say to look around the classroom at all the differences amongst you and your classmates, but, well, yeah, we're here. But pretend. Just imagine some of your friends, family members, etc. We're all very, very different, while still being quite similar, but there are some big differences that you can pick up on immediately between individuals of any given species, even dogs and cats of the same breed. You can see variations in their eye color, their coat color, their behaviors, way maybe their paws are shaped. It should be very obvious that there are differences among these species. Even things like giraffes and zebras that look super, super similar, no two giraffes and no two zebras have the exact same spot or stripe patterns.